this segment of one of my favorite verses today, which I always align with one of the most important growth producing or growth relatable or uh, important concepts today is get the log out of your own eye first. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, some of you who are, if you've been a person of faith for very long or you've hung out in the Bible, you've heard this saying, get the log out of your own eye first before you try to get the speck out of your brother or sister's eye. Well, where does that come from? What does it mean? And what does it have to do with psychology? And what does it have to do with growth? And what does that have to do with change? Well, a heck of a lot. It all goes, it's that verses from the Bible. And then you see Freud picked up on it heavily when he started to try to help people with their issues. He would find that a lot of times they were seeing and experiencing and feeling things in other people that weren't there. And these are normal people. The concept is called transference. And transference is when we have something in our head that is an experience of a person, a relationship from our past, like an authority figure, like a parent. Say you had a critical parent. Well, then sometimes we have a relationship with somebody who's really not that critical, but we experience them as critical. We experience them as abusive. We experience them as this, that, and the other. And then we get into a relationship with them that's not a real relationship. It's based on our transferring the feelings that we used to have with this other person onto them. That's one way, or something called projection. And projection is when we have a feeling that we're not really owning or aware of, and we're projecting that feeling onto somebody else, and we're seeing it on them or in them or by them. And really what we're talking about is ourselves. You might have had this experience with, when you talk about people and they just start going off on somebody and can you believe they blah, 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 blah. And you're sitting there going, dude, that's you. You're just describing yourself. Well, the other person may or may not be like that, but you know that it's at least enhanced in the way they feel it. Well, that's important. It's really important for marriage. It's important for dating. It's important for work. It's important for life. And it's especially important for achievement of goals. And it's even especially important for a lot of our clinical issues. But let me talk about one of my favorite verses here where that is talked about by Jesus. Listen to this. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way that you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So the standard that we hold somebody to, if we're going to go off on every imperfection, well, then, we're going to reap that in our own head and in our own life. And one day at the seat of the judge, it's just that's just fair, right? You got to be under the same standards. So here's what he says about judging people. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? That's what the person I was talking about. Can you believe they? What? And I'm going, dude, you got some issues that you should look at first. You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not, well, it just goes on from there. So here's the point I wanted to make. Not necessarily so much about judgment, even though that is a topic I'd like to talk about one day. When we judge people, and by the way, judge is not evaluate, right? If you see something in somebody that's dysfunctional, that's downright sinful, that's destructive, that's not helpful, whatever place on the continuum, there are psychological and spiritual felonies, and then there's misdemeanors. I hate it, by the way. Please, please, please don't ever say this sentence to me. Now, I hear people say this all the time. I was like, well, all sin is sin, like it's all equal. No, it's not. It's not all equal. It hasn't been all equal since God first started to talk about it, all the way through when Jesus talked about it. I mean, remember the Pharisees? He said, you do the tithe and you tithe, mint and dill and cumin. He said, but you have neglected the weightier measures of the law, like justice and mercy and faithfulness. I mean, somebody, skips making a donation one week. That's not the same as if they go, have adultery or do something oppressive or unjust. They're not the same. So just wanted to get that out of the way. That's a different rant because I hear people say that all the time. But this thing about judgment, we it's not wrong to see something wrong. That's not what judgment is. The judge looks at all the evidence and looks at the infractions, and the judge evaluates that, and the judge, renders a judgment, right? So it's not about what you're seeing, it's about what position you are in to play God and render a judgment on that person, because you don't know where they're coming from. You don't know what's happened to them. Or the other direction, you don't know how many chances they've blown off, and you're giving them one too many. You might be too lenient on them. So, some people say, well, I don't want to judge, and they feel bad about seeing that somebody is clearly in the wrong. There's nothing wrong with evaluating behavior. What's wrong is putting ourselves above that other person, looking down on them, and judging them as if we're up here and they're down there. Another place, many places in the Bible, God calls this the raised eyebrow, which is basically, I think, the Hebrew word for narcissism. It's when you're above somebody, looking down at them like you're better than them. That's arrogance and all of that. So we don't want to do that. But here's the point of today. It's the order. He said, get the log out of our own eye first so that you can see clearly. So that you can see clearly. Here's the problem. We have crap in our heads that is just distorting our view of somebody. How many times you ever been in a gathering? This happens in work settings all the time. Somebody will say this, and somebody have this idea, and somebody have this idea, and then the boss might say this. And then one person leaves the meeting and says, I can't believe how critical she is. I can't believe how, and somebody else going, well, I didn't hear it that way. Didn't seem that way to me. Just was, normal feedback. Well, there you go. See, sometimes, and this isn't a moral thing, sometimes we're walking around with just unfinished woundedness, and we hear things in ways that are, it's like value add to them. Like somebody was being mean when they really weren't. Or sometimes the flip side of that. I mean, somebody can be really enabling, and the log in their own eye is that they are so freaking codependent that they can't even see that the person that they're with is being a real, what? Everybody else is going, why do you let him get away with that? Well, they just had a hard life, or, no, you got some issues. You got some issues in having difficulty confronting somebody. So it can go in either direction. This isn't just that we over confront or over feel things. We can under confront and under feel things. And that can be the way it happens as well. So what about this? What about when you feel like, well, that person really doesn't like me? and you know the other person, or somebody else knows the other person, they go, no, I talked to them. They really do like you a lot. Well, why do you feel that way? Well, maybe there's something inside from a past relationship, as transference would tell us, that is distorting my view that when they're quiet, maybe that's because they're introverted, not because they're sitting there thinking critical thoughts about me. And what I've seen is in doing long-term therapy for a lot of years with a lot of people is it is amazing, amazing how the views of other people in their life change as they get well. They begin to see certain kinds of people that they thought were jerks as really enjoyable, or certain people that they thought were really cute as really narcissistic, gaslighting, toxic freaks that they should avoid. They used to fall in love with them. And now they're like calling 911 every time they see them because they're finally healthy enough to see what a crazy person these people are. But you got to get your vision cleared up before you try to hand the oxygen to the person on the journey with you. So I say all this to say a couple things. Number one, when we're in a relationship or have an interaction with somebody, we should always question our perceptions. Always. Am I seeing this right? Am I understanding this right? Am I overreacting? Is this a sensitive place for me? Do I need to go sleep on it? I can't tell you how many times in my own life I've had a difficult like interaction, in some business setting or something, and it gets pretty heated, and because in some, it's just high stakes, and everybody's and and then I've gone away from the meeting, and sometime the next day I'm going, he did have a point. There's some truth to what he or she was saying, but in the moment I couldn't see it. I've had that happen 10,000 times because your brain starts to make other associations and starts to calm down, and so I just want to remind us, like Freud said, and like Jesus said, and like any other psychologist that's worth their shingle, is just because you're feeling something doesn't mean it's true. And just because you're seeing something doesn't mean it's true. And the trick is to treat it as true when it's not true. In other words, this is the good part of the phrase, well, that's my truth. Well, that's true. It is my truth in that that's how I'm experiencing it. But we also have to hold that in relationship to there is external reality that my truth may be different than. And that's what's gotten lost. I think this started happening in the field of psychology back in, I'm going to call it the 90s ish, sort of. Yeah, right around there, it started really gaining more. There's a whole field of intersubjectivity and a lot of other kind of things that started happening where somebody's subjective reality was reality. And a lot of the psychologists started to move in the direction of, and this is very important in one sense, that people's feelings must be validated in order to be healed and worked with and understood and all that. And it is true that they feel that way. But when we draw a link from the way that somebody feels to that is reality, then we've lost reality. Because you could put 5 people in a room and 4 of them are going to see it differently than the 5th one. So what is reality? if we're making subjective reality reality. There's a lot of problems with that from both sides. But what I'm saying is we have to be humble enough in a relationship to ask the question, did they mean it that way? Am I overreacting? But you're not overreacting, are you? Because I just said what you're feeling is true. Now we're talking about getting the log out, right? No, I do feel put down. You're right, you do, and you were, and that's true. But it was your mother or your father or your brother or your aunt or grandmother or somebody that wound is not yet healed. And so now when other people give you feedback or criticize you, you do feel put down. That is true. So we got to find out the truth of where that comes from and work through that and resolve it. I'll never forget this one example. This woman came to see me about her abusive, controlling, angry, a lot of other words, husband. And the way she described him, I mean, the guy was like, scariest. I mean, he should have been, you know, on some James Bond movie is, from the other side, like just evil, scary person that, will cut your ears off or something. And so she's describing him, and she's has all this fear about, and she can't speak up, and so I said, well, I think we need to get him in here. And she goes, no, we can't. No. I said, no, I'd like to talk to him. And she goes, no, because it would be too frightening. And the way she was describing it, she really felt like I was going to be in danger if I were to confront him with anything of this and the other. And so I'm checking this out, and it doesn't sound exactly quite right. And I said, well, if that happens, I'll tell him to leave. Well, no, you better not do that, because then if that happens, I'll call the police. And she goes, well, I don't know. Okay, I'll call the army. Okay. And it's like in her head, there was nobody strong enough to contain how powerful this guy was. And so I said, well, I still want to get him in here. So she agreed to it. And she came in first and talked to him, kind of preparing her for this. And so then he shows up, and I go out in the waiting room, and I meet this guy, and I said, are you Mr. So-and-so? He goes, and he gets up and he stands up and he goes, hello, Dr. Clown. It's so nice to meet you. And he's like this little, I don't know what the word would be. Not timid, but kind of anything but Terminator. And I mean, I had seen transference before, obviously, but that's an example of what I'm talking about. And I've seen people be afraid of people that they don't need to be afraid of. There are people you should be afraid of, by the way. There are people you shouldn't be in the same room with. So don't write me emails and saying, so you're saying I'm dreaming all this up about my abusive. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying in this particular case, that was a distortion. And I've seen people be afraid to give their opinion, or be afraid to be assertive, or be afraid to say no, and all of that, when they were not in any danger physically or psychologically, but they were in their own heads because they hadn't worked through the stuff in their own heads first. So this can happen a number of ways. Let me give you a couple of things to think about. Number one, you may be disowning your own strengths. The log in your own eye that you might have to get out of your own eye is the distortion. Some people see other people as powerful because they're denying their own power and projecting it onto the other. And so you see the other person as powerful because you've diminished yourself. That's where the old phrase came back. Well, why do you give them so much power? All you have to do is say no, right? So you may be negating and denying your own power, your own thoughts, your own opinions, and all of that. Number two, it might be old woundedness. Number three, It might be that we're in denial about something. And we just don't want to look at our own issues. That's human. It's a problem, but it's human. So anyway, judge not, lest you be judged. But that doesn't mean don't evaluate people. We have to evaluate people, or you're going to get in train wreck relationships all the time because you want to avoid unsafe people. Nor will you not confront problems in relationships that are real problems. So I'm all about confronting. He does say after we get the log out. And see, we're not going to confront well until we get the log out either. So this is why I'm putting the mask on ourselves first. Before you go criticizing, then make sure you're ready. That may be even getting stronger, not just less judgmental. And sometimes if you go to my webinar on the art of confrontation, one of the things I talk about in the webinar when you have to do an intervention, difficult person or a confrontation of some sort, is before you do that is to go bleed off all the emotion first. Get the log out of your own eye first. In other words, I don't want you going in there subject to too much pain because it's going to keep you from doing the confrontation you need to oftentimes. Okay, so there's our verse for the day. Get the log out of our own eye first.